Chapter 4. Solomon stood in his chamber, the first light of dawn filtering through the narrow windows, casting long shadows on the stone walls. The cool air of the lingering night caressed his bare skin, sending a shiver down his spine. His eyes, still heavy with sleep, traveled to the scar that marred his side, a jagged line of puckered flesh, a stark reminder of the battle with the leader of the Phantom's fist. The memory of the great sword cutting through the air, its blade biting into his flesh, flashed before his eyes. He traced the scar with his fingertips, the skin uneven and rough under his touch. The pain had dulled with time, but the ache in his heart remained fresh. It was a wound of a different kind, one that whispered of mortality and the thin line between life and death. He was alive, and for that he felt a rush of gratitude, but he could have just as easily died. The thought would not leave his mind. Solomon turned his view away from the scar and reached for his red tunic. The fabric was soft and familiar, a comforting presence against his skin as he pulled it over his head. The rich crimson color, a symbol of his house, a signal to those who saw him that he was Solomon of House Stormbreaker. He adjusted the tunic, smoothing out the wrinkles, and then reached for the dragon pin. It was an intricate piece of craftsmanship, its eyes gleaming with tiny rubies, its wings outstretched as if about to take flight. He fastened it to his chest, feeling the cool metal against his skin, a silent emblem of his lineage and the weight of the expectations placed upon him. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp morning air, and exhaled slowly. The day ahead loomed large in his mind, a series of tasks and challenges that demanded his focus and strength. His heart beat steadily, a rhythm that he tried to match with his breathing, seeking calm in the routine of preparation. Solomon walked to the window and looked out over the courtyard below. The castle was stirring to life, the sounds of soldiers readying themselves for the day's duties, mingling with the distant clatter of the kitchens preparing the morning meal. The world was waking up, and so must he. He allowed himself one last moment of quiet reflection, feeling the gravity of his survival and the determination it had kindled within him. He had rushed into battle against the rebels with only a handful of men. It had been a stupid thing to do. He was, after all, only a mortal man, and not even a well-trained knight. He again touched the place where his scar was and made a vow to never rush into something like that again. With a final deep breath, he turned away from the window and strode towards the door, ready to face whatever the day might bring. The city was restless under the weight of the new taxes. The air was thick with tension, whispers of dissent slipping through the alleyways and markets. Solomon, aware of the growing unrest, decided to take a more direct approach to addressing the people's grievances. Accompanied by Sir Matthew, he set out to investigate rumors of a secret meeting place where traitors gathered. The master of spies had informed his council of a blooming black market where people were shifting goods around the city to try and avoid the taxes he had placed on them to help his brother. A bunch of traitors, he reflected bitterly. How dare these common people not be willing to sacrifice for their king? His brother was out there right now risking his life to protect this city and its people. And what thanks had they gotten? Merchandise and goods slipping from hand to hand under the cover of darkness, as everyone attempted to avoid paying his or her fair share. Solomon and Sir Matthew rode side by side out of the grand gates of the Dragon Castle, their horses' hooves clattering on the stone pathway. The castle, perched high atop the mountain, gave way to a sprawling city that cascaded down the rugged slopes like a waterfall of stone and adobe. The air was dry, and the wind carried a hint of sand, whispering through the narrow streets and stirring the edges of Solomon's red tunic. As they descended, the signs of daily struggle in the barren desert world became starkly apparent. Women with lined faces and weary eyes carried heavy baskets of goods, their children trailing behind like shadows. Men with sunburned skin and calloused hands worked tirelessly, repairing rooftops, mending broken tools, and coaxing life from the dusty earth. The city clung to the mountainside, its buildings a haphazard jumble of survival and necessity. Solomon's gaze swept over the scene, his heart heavy with the weight of their hardships. Every face told a story of endurance, every movement a testament to the unyielding spirit of his people. As they passed, some paused to nod respectfully, recognizing the dragon pin that glinted on his chest. They continued their ride until they reached a small bustling square where a fountain stood at its center. The water, a rare and precious resource, gushed from the mouth of a stone dragon, its scales worn smooth by years of touch. Children, their laughter a bright spot in the dusty world, played around the fountain, splashing in the shallow basin and filling clay jars with water. Solomon reined in his horse and watched as Sir Matthew dismounted, his red armor gleaming in the harsh sunlight. The knight's presence drew the attention of the young boys, their eyes wide with awe and curiosity. They gathered around him, their excitement palpable. "Sir, is that a real sword?" one of the boys asked, his eyes fixed on the weapon at Matthew's side. "It is," Matthew replied with a smile, unsheathing the blade just enough to let the steel catch the light. "Can we see it? Can we hold it?" Another boy chimed in, his voice eager. Matthew chuckled and shook his head. "A sword is a heavy responsibility, but how about this?" He picked up a fallen branch, its length just right for a mock duel. "Who wants to spar with a knight?" The boys' cheers echoed through the square as Matthew handed the branch to a boy who looked no older than 10. The knight took a defensive stance, wielding his own thin stick, brandishing it like an imaginary sword, and began a playful duel. The boy lunged and parried, mimicking the moves he had seen from soldiers in the city. The other children cheered him on, their faces alight with dreams of knighthood. Solomon watched the scene unfold, a rare smile tugging at his lips. For a moment, the burdens of leadership and the weight of survival seemed to lift, replaced by the simple joy of childhood and the hope for a brighter future. Eventually, Matthew returned the stick to the boy and mounted his horse. The children waved them off, their shouts of farewell following them as they continued their journey. Sir Matthew smiled at his chancellor. "One day those boys will defend this city. They are the future, my friend." Solomon shrugged, his expression grim. "Only if Otto wins this war." Their destination was an unassuming building in a less reputable part of the city, a house of ill repute that had allegedly become a hub for black market dealings and seditious talk. Solomon knew it was a risky venture, but he needed to confront the source of the rumors head-on. As they approached the house, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets. The building itself was nondescript, its windows covered by heavy curtains, and the faint sounds of laughter and music spilled into the street. Solomon exchanged a glance with Sir Matthew, who nodded in silent support. They entered the establishment, greeted by the dim light of oil lamps and the mingled scents of perfume and smoke. The room was filled with people, their conversations hushed as they noticed the newcomers. Solomon's presence, marked by his distinctive tunic and the golden dragon pin, drew curious and wary glances. A woman approached them, her steps graceful and her demeanor confident. She was striking, with dark hair pulled back in an elaborate braid and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Welcome, my lords. I am Alicia, the proprietor of this establishment. How may I assist you?" Solomon inclined his head, his voice steady. "Good evening, Alicia. We have heard troubling rumors about gatherings here, meetings of those who oppose the new taxes and speak of rebellion. We are here to ensure the safety and stability of the realm." Alicia's smile was enigmatic. "Rumors have a way of growing larger than the truth, my lord. I assure you my establishment is merely a place of leisure and entertainment." Sir Matthew glanced around the room at half-naked serving girls that rushed about carrying trays of ale, beer, and high-quality food to the men that sat around the wooden tables. The knight's face turned pink, then bright red, as he watched the girls' breasts bouncing up and down against the thin fabric of their clothes. The man coughed and straightened himself, looking up at the ceiling and trying to ignore the young women all about him. Solomon studied the woman, sensing a depth to her words and a hidden intelligence. "I see. Nevertheless, I would like to look around and speak to some of your patrons." "Of course," Alicia said smoothly, stepping aside. "You are welcome to explore. If you need anything, please let me know." The woman gave Sir Matthew a sly grin. "Anything at all. "We are here to serve you." The knight almost tripped over himself as he stumbled past her and rushed after Solomon. As Solomon and Sir Matthew moved through the room, they listened carefully to the conversations around them. Most were mundane, but occasionally they caught snippets of dissatisfaction and veiled threats against the new regime. Solomon's eyes narrowed as he realized that discontent was indeed festering here. Suddenly, a young bald boy, no older than 12, darted past them. Solomon felt a tug at his chest and realized with a shock that the boy had stolen his golden dragon pin. "Stop, thief!" he shouted, breaking into a run. The boy was quick, weaving through the crowded room and out the back door into a narrow alley. Solomon followed, his heart pounding. Sir Matthew was close behind, but as they emerged into the alley, they found themselves surrounded. Several men, their faces masked and their weapons drawn, closed in on them. The young bald boy took a step back from the bigger men, as light and quick on his feet as a cat. He grinned at the Chancellor and clutched the golden pin tightly in his fist. Solomon gritted his teeth, cursing under his breath. It was a trap, and he had walked right into it. Solomon drew his sword, the steel glinting in the fading light. "Stand down," he commanded, his voice cold, but his hand shook. The men did not heed his warning. They attacked, their movements coordinated and deadly. Solomon fought with what little skill he had. His brother had been the warrior, but he knew a thing or two about fighting. Well, at least more than these men that were barefoot and dressed in old rags. He doubted any of them had ever even held a real sword before. The narrow alleyway of the city echoed with the clash of steel and the shouts of men. Solomon and Sir Matthew moved through the street, their swords flashing in the dim light. They faced a dozen men, barefoot and clad in rags, their eyes wild with desperation. Armed with swords and knives, the attackers lunged at the two warriors with reckless abandon. Solomon parried a wild swing from one of the ragged men, his sword a blur of motion. He countered with a swift slash, cutting down his assailant with a grim efficiency. Beside him, Sir Matthew fought with a ferocity that matched the chaos around them. His blade plunged into the chest of one attacker before he spun to block a knife thrust from another. The man in rags crumpled to the ground, blood pooling at his feet. The battle raged on, the alleyways filled with the sounds of clashing swords and the grunts of exertion. Solomon and Matthew moved as one, their movements precise and deadly. They cut through their enemies one after the other in a desperate bid to survive. A sudden movement caught Solomon's eye. The bald boy darted from the shadows. His eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and determination. In his hand he clutched a small, wicked-looking knife. The boy launched himself at Solomon with a scream, the knife aimed for the man's side. Solomon turned too late. The blade bit into his shoulder and he gasped in pain. Instinctively, he swung his arm, tossing the boy aside. The kid hit the ground hard, the knife skittering from his grasp. Solomon clutched his bleeding shoulder, his eyes locking with the boy's for a moment. He saw bitterness and rage in the young child's eyes. "He wants me dead." Solomon reflected as the pain of his wound shot through him. Half the people in this city wanted him dead. "Stay down," Solomon commanded the boy, his voice strained but authoritative. He turned back to the fight, swinging his sword to parry another attack. Sir Matthew, noticing Solomon's injury, fought with renewed vigor. His sword became a whirlwind, cutting down two more attackers in rapid succession. The ragged men faltered, their numbers dwindling, and fear began to creep into their eyes. With one final coordinated push, Solomon and Matthew dispatched the remaining attackers. The alley fell silent, the ground littered with the bodies of the fallen. Solomon, breathing heavily, clutched his wounded shoulder. Amid the chaos, the young boy who had stolen his pin stood frozen, clutching the precious emblem in his small hand. As Solomon dispatched the last of the attackers, he turned to the boy, his eyes hard. He lifted his bloody blade and pointed it at the child, but before he could act, Elysia appeared at the entrance to the alley, her face pale. "Please, my lord," she called out, her voice urgent. "Spare the boy. He is my son." Solomon hesitated, his gaze shifting from Elysia to the boy. The child looked terrified, his eyes wide with fear. Slowly, Solomon lowered his sword and extended a hand to the boy. "Come here," he said gently. The boy hesitated, then took a tentative step forward, placing the dragon pin back into Solomon's hand. Solomon closed his fist and stood up straight, towering over the young man. "You're as quick as a cat," he said. "What's your name?" The boy swallowed nervously. "They call me Catpad, sir." Solomon nodded, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Well, Catpad, you've certainly earned your name. Now, let's get you and your mother inside." Back inside the establishment, Solomon and Sir Matthew were seated in a private room with Elysia and Catpad. The boy clung to his mother's side, his eyes darting nervously between the adults. Elysia's composed demeanor had softened, replaced by a mother's concern. "I'm sorry for what happened," Elysia began, her voice sincere. "I didn't know about the trap. I would never have allowed it had I known." Solomon shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "You knew." His voice was icy cold, and he saw fear in her eyes as she clutched her son tightly to herself. "This is your establishment. Your own son took me out there. Don't play dumb with me." He gritted his teeth in anger as he watched the uncomfortable expression on her face. She was an older woman, the beauty of her youth failing from too many years and to many hardships, yet he could tell that she had been very lovely once, and she carried herself with such authority that he felt an odd sense of admiration for her. Elysia sighed, her eyes troubled. "People come here because they are desperate. The new taxes have made life difficult for many, and some see rebellion as their only option. I try to keep the peace, but I can't control everyone. These people need to respect their king," he reminded her. "These people are starving," she reminded him. "We pass them in the streets every day, dying in the dirt as you lords fight your wars and play God. This war is for the holy city." He reminded her, his voice sternly. "I don't give a damn about your holy city," she spat out like venom, "or your damn goddess." The woman clutched her son more tightly to herself. "I care about bread to feed my child." Solomon leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I need to know who is behind this. Names, Elysia. This rebellion must be stopped before it tears the city apart." She said nothing. Solomon let out a tired sigh, the weight of the day beginning to catch up to him. "The punishment for treason against your king is death," he told her. She still did not move. Solomon looked at Catpad, and then back to her, saying, "I hope you know when it comes to treason, the law doesn't care about the age of the person committing the crime." Elysia hesitated, then nodded. "There are a few agitators, men who come here and are stoking the fires of discontent. I can give you their names, but you must promise me something in return." Solomon raised an eyebrow. "And what is that?" "Spare my son," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "He was only trying to survive. Punish me if you must, but leave him out of this." Solomon looked at Catpad, who was watching him with wide, fearful eyes. He felt a pang of empathy for the boy, caught up in events beyond his control. "I give you my word," he said softly. "Your son will not be harmed." Elysia nodded, relief flooding her features. "Thank you, my lord. I will tell you everything I know." Over the next hour, Elysia provided Solomon and Sir Matthew with detailed information about the agitators and their plans. She spoke of secret meetings, hidden caches of weapons, and the leaders who were driving the rebellion. Solomon listened intently, his mind racing with the implications. When she was finished, Solomon stood, his resolve firm. "Thank you, Elysia. You have done the realm a great service. We will act on this information and put an end to the rebellion." Elysia stood as well, her expression weary but grateful. "I hope you can bring peace to the city, my lord, and thank you for sparing my son." Solomon glanced at Catpad, who was still clutching his mother's hand. "Take care of him, Elysia. He's a quick one, and he might just grow up to be a fine man." Elysia smiled faintly. "I will, and thank you, my lord." As they turned to leave, she called out to them one last time, her voice cracking from the stress, but her insistence shining through. "Don't forget about us." He paused, unsure what to say. "Your goddess cares about the poor and downtrodden too, doesn't she?" the woman asked. "Or is it only the king and his high lords that she serves?" Solomon said nothing. He turned his back on her and walked silently out into the darkness. Solomon and Sir Matthew returned to the castle. His shoulder was burning with pain where the boy had stabbed him, and his mind was heavy with the burden of what they had learned. "Call a council meeting at once," Solomon commanded. "In the middle of the night, my lord?" Sir Matthew questioned. "Everyone will be sleeping." "Wake them," he barked back. The council's meeting chamber was dimly lit, its members unkempt and rubbing the sleep from their eyes. Lady Ophelia was the first to react to the news, her long brunette hair falling about her face and shoulders in an unbrushed mess, her expression grim. "This is worse than we thought. We must act quickly to apprehend these leaders and dismantle their network." Eric nodded in agreement. He yawned and rubbed his eyes. "We can't afford to let this rebellion gain more ground. The city is already on edge." The Master of Spies, his eyes glinting with determination, added, "My men will move immediately. We will arrest these agitators and confiscate their weapons." Solomon nodded, his expression resolute. "Do whatever it takes. We must restore order and ensure the safety of our people." The chamber fell silent, as the true problem facing their people went unmentioned. Solomon hardened his heart to the unspoken idea he sensed they all shared. He would not lower the taxes. It was the duty of the people to serve their king. If he needed their resources, they should be more than grateful to give them and play some small part in protecting their realm. The Master of Spies rose from his seat in the dimly lit chamber, shadows playing across his face. His voice was measured but edged with concern. "Chancellor, as long as the taxes remain high, the people will suffer. Rebellion will brew like a storm on the horizon." Solomon, seated and clutching his wounds, leaned back and waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense," he said, his tone light and unconcerned. "Duna's people are under the same strain to support their king. This war is a waiting game, a test of endurance. We must see who can keep their king supplied the longest." The Master of Spies frowned, disappointment flickering in his eyes. He had hoped for more understanding from this leader, more foresight. "My lord," he said, his voice lowering to a near whisper, "if we continue to push our people so hard, their loyalty may waver. We risk losing more than just this war." "There has already been an attempt on your life," Ophelia pointed out, as she brushed her long, slender fingers through her hair and out of her face. "How many more times must the people of this city try to kill you before you see reason?" Solomon's gaze hardened, and he straightened in his seat. "As long as the Tirat Empire continue to oppose us, we have no choice. We must push our people to their limits and trust in their loyalty to the crown. They will endure to the end." "It's Alzaria they want," the Queen's brother pointed out, sounding bored. "Some would say this isn't even our fight." Solomon took a deep breath and gritted his teeth against the pain. He clutched his dragon pin and looked at each of them. "Alzaria matters," he told them boldly. "I am in command here, and until one of these common-born bastards successfully kills me, you will all do as I say." He clutched the pin even tighter, feeling his father's strength in him. The Master of Spies bowed his head slightly, accepting the man's decision, though the weight of it pressed heavily on his shoulders. The room fell silent, the tension palpable, as Solomon returned to his thoughts, undisturbed by the warnings of his council. Solomon left the council chamber, the weight of his decisions pressing heavily on his shoulders. He climbed the winding staircase to the top of the highest tower in the castle, seeking solitude. The night air was cool against his skin as he stepped onto the parapet, the sprawling city below, bathed in moonlight. Far below, he saw Sir Matthew marching through the streets with a contingent of soldiers, their torches flickering like angry fireflies. They moved with purpose, a grim determination evident in their steady pace. Their mission was clear: to root out the leaders of the resistance network and put an end to their rebellion. Solomon leaned on the cold stone of the parapet, his eyes following the trail of torchlight as it snaked through the city's alleyways and narrow streets. He felt a pang of sorrow, knowing that by sunrise he might be the most hated man in the city. His heart ached with the realization, but he forced himself to focus on the bigger picture. He prayed that future generations would forgive him for the harsh measures he had to take. Winning against the Tirat Empire was all that mattered now. His brother needed supplies, reinforcements, and unwavering support. Without these, their cause was doomed. Solomon knew that his actions tonight were necessary, even if they brought him scorn and hatred. The only way to ensure victory was to secure those supplies and support, no matter the cost. His thoughts drifted to the woman and her son, their faces etched into his memory. He had seen too many like them, caught in the crossfire of a war they had no part in. He thought of the bald boy, Cat-Pat, and the desperation in his eyes. These were the people who suffered most in this conflict. Solomon closed his eyes and bowed his head, a silent prayer escaping his lips. "Goddess, have mercy on my soul," he whispered into the night. "Forgive me for the pain I must cause. Let my actions today ensure a brighter tomorrow for those who come after." The city below continued its restless sleep, unaware of the turmoil and the decisions being made above. Solomon remained on the tower, watching until the torches disappeared into the labyrinth of streets. He steeled himself for the dawn, knowing that whatever hatred he faced, it was a burden he must bear for the sake of his people and their future.